Meanwhile, in America, advancements to a machine called the decorticator allowed hemp fibers to be stripped from the plant at a far more efficient rate, leading to popular mechanics calling cannabis the new billion-dollar crop. Hemp had already been superior in that it takes significantly less time to grow than trees. But now, with production simplified by the decorticator, it was really no contest whatsoever. This didn't sit well with publisher and industrialist William Randolph Hearst, who, aside from owning much of the media at this time, also owned the paper factories on which his newspapers were printed. Soon, he began publishing propaganda pieces insisting that Mexican immigrants who smoked cannabis violently raped women. As society had grown familiar with cannabis and its many benefits, Hearst chose to use the term marijuana, which had, up until this point, only been used to describe a wild Mexican variety of tobacco completely unrelated to cannabis. Soon, the dangers of this new supposed threat had alarmed American society. A small church group produced a morality tale entitled "Tell Your Children" about this new drug that supposedly made its users turn violent.
Marijuana, the burning weed with its roots in hell.
At this time, a new motion picture code had recently been instituted by the US government, which prevented movies from featuring gratuitous violence or sex. An opportunistic film producer, Dwayne Esper, purchased Tell Your Children, recutting the film to include such taboo behavior so he could distribute it on the exploitation film circuit that had sprung up in response to these new film regulations. He renamed it Reefer Madness.
Debauchery, violence, murder, suicide, and the ultimate end of the marijuana addict. Hopeless insanity. See this important pill now, before it is too late.
For Esper, like Hearst, it was really all about the money. But the American people truly did begin to fear this dangerous drug, marijuana, largely due to the steadily growing stream of propaganda. Hearst quickly used his resources to begin lobbying politicians, including Harry Anslinger, head of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, a precursor to today's DEA. Up until that point, the FBN was in charge of preventing opiates, like heroin, from being smuggled into the country. But Anslinger soon made marijuana a top priority, drafting the Marijuana Tax Act of 1937 to greatly diminish the strength of the hemp industry that was beginning to affect both Hearst paper and DuPont's nylon sales. Even the American Medical Association believed that the act went too far. They claimed that the bill, which had quickly been drafted in secrecy, did not allow adequate time to prepare a legal opposition. Also, with the term marijuana used instead of cannabis, the AMA's legal defense, Dr. William Creighton Woodward, argued that marijuana is not the correct term, yet the burden of this bill is placed heavily on the doctors and pharmacists of this country. In spite of all this, the new law was passed hastily, facing little opposition. The first string of arrests were made the following day. Part of the new law indicated that tax stamps were supposed to be given to those interested in growing cannabis, but virtually none were issued. And farmers feared that by seeking the government's approval on the matter, they would be incriminating themselves. One of the main opponents of the law was the mayor of New York City, Fiorello LaGuardia, for whom LaGuardia Airport is named. In 1938, he appointed a commission to investigate the new bill, later creating the LaGuardia Committee, to oppose Anslinger's draconian campaign against cannabis. The committee was unsuccessful, and in 1942, cannabis was officially removed from medical texts. That same year, the U.S. Department of Agriculture and even the Army themselves urged farmers to grow hemp, releasing a propaganda film of their own, Hemp for Victory, talking about the importance of the crop.
This is hemp seed. Be careful how you use it. For to grow hemp legally, you must have a federal registration and tax stamp. This is provided for in your contract. Ask your AAA committeeman or your county agent about it. Don't forget.
Soon, with World War II in full swing, tax stamps were issued to allow the plant to be grown. But this change of heart was short-lived, and cannabis arrests continued, increasing during this period, as did the drug's popularity. Finally, in 1969, after being arrested for possession, Harvard professor and psychedelic pioneer Timothy Leary challenged the Marijuana Tax Act in court.
You've been arrested a number of times for possession of marijuana. Were any of those legitimate?
No, as a matter of fact, I've never been legitimately arrested. I'm in prison now because one evening I was in a parked car and a policeman came up to the car and opened the door against my wishes and made a pass at the ashtray and said, "You're under arrest for, I said, for what? He said, for marijuana. I said, what marijuana? He reached in his pocket and pulled out 2 joints I'd never seen before, half joints. And said, "You're under arrest."
In Leary versus the United States, it was determined by a federal judge that the Marijuana Tax Act was unconstitutional, and the law was overruled. In response, Congress passed the Controlled Substance Act of 1970 to ensure that cannabis remained illegal, as it was used heavily by the anti-war hippie counterculture and Black Americans fighting for civil rights. The DEA was born. President Nixon hired a team of scientists to prove the dangers of this substance to help justify his decision. When just the opposite was found, and the commission he had appointed called for the decriminalization of marijuana, he threw the study in the trash. Cannabis has been illegal at the federal level ever since. Over the years, numerous states have seen the error of their ways and decriminalized it, with some legalizing it for medicinal and even recreational purposes. Now, nearly 3/4 of the US population supports legalization, but there has been a heavy pushback by the federal government, with lobbyists from the private prison industry and the Prison Guards Union, among many others, objecting to any legalization efforts. Thousands remain in prison, largely due to the propaganda and anti-drug sentiment of years past. It's worth noting the racial disparity in these drug arrests, with the majority of incarcerated non-violent drug offenders being minorities. That's why it's now more important than ever for us, as a society, to look at humanity's long-standing history of cannabis consumption as a dietary staple, a sacrament, a medicine, and even its use as a textile, and to realize the error of our ways. Cannabis users are not the violent rapists they were made out to be in the 1930s, any more than they are the lazy slacker stereotype perpetuated by the media today. While there are certainly people smoking weed in their mom's basement, other users are doctors, lawyers, religious leaders, and yes, even politicians, along with virtually all other facets of the American public, with cannabis being one of the most widely consumed drugs. Modern studies have concluded that it is hundreds of times safer than alcohol. It's even safer than Tylenol. The fail laws of yesteryear, the narrow, two-dimensional stereotypes, the anti-science and anti-intellectual arguments for prohibition, need to be revisited, questioned, and challenged. For those fighting against cancer, which more than 100 studies prove cannabis can kill, or people suffering from epilepsy, on which CBD has a profound effect, or people with autism, or Alzheimer's, or gout, for the people serving time in jail for getting caught with a couple of grams, for the innovators, the artists, seekers of a deeper insight, the writers, the prophets, for the betterment of humanity.